Hello AP US History folks. This is going to be a pretty brief video that is going to discuss the situations in Europe leading into the Age of Exploration. So essentially what motivated Europeans to explore the New World. And it's also going to look at what happens once these indigenous societies come in contact with Europeans. Okay, also before I move on, I just thought that this was a really interesting, it's an engraving, it's an artist's rendering of the initial contact between American Indians and European explorers, and it's just sort of interesting. I'll kind of let it speak for itself, but if you look at the difference in weaponry, we could certainly talk about this further in class about what this has to do with perspective and bias and these things. All right, so moving on. So first off, it's important for us to realize that Europe was in a pretty chaotic period going into the Age of Exploration, which began in the late 1400s and of course continued into the 16th century or the 1500s, right? So one of the major things that's happening in Europe is that increasingly farms are becoming enclosed, right? I'm sure remember the Enclosure Movement from European history last year. So essentially what this means is that properties are farmland is essentially becoming privatized, right? The haves are able to purchase it and the have-nots are going to be left out. So this is just, one image of sort of a private agricultural area. But what this means is that if you have cattle to graze, if you want to farm a certain type of crop and you want to make it cut off from wild animals trying to eat your food and so on, I mean, essentially, if you have the money, you are able to close off or fence off your property, right? If you don't have enough money to purchase private property, this means that you're stuck with the communal land that is becoming much harder to come across. Okay, so essentially, the enclosure movement is very bad for farmers who don't have as much money. And so what's going to happen is they're going to increasingly move to the cities to try to find jobs. This is going to increasingly lead to overpopulation in the cities. It's going to lead to people with less money to resort to crime in order to feed their families. Very dense population means that living conditions are not particularly sanitary. So you sort of get the idea. Now, there are some historians that argue that the enclosure movement was better in some ways than the traditional viewpoint. And if you think about that, I mean, you could essentially make the argument that necessity is the mother of invention. When people were forced to move to the cities, this actually caused a diversification of labor. And the very poor living conditions eventually are going to lead to some improvements in urban life. But regardless, the enclosure movement was one of the major reasons why people moved. Then there's also this issue of primogeniture, and this is sort of a cheesy cartoon that you see here, but what primogeniture means is left over from feudalism. It means that all property would automatically go to the oldest male heir, right? So most likely the oldest son, okay? So that's what you see here. Say hypothetically, you are the younger brother of that son, or younger sister for that matter, but that's an entirely different matter. If you are the younger brother, you get nothing, okay? Absolutely nothing. So you can see why historically there were often instances where for whatever mysterious reason, the oldest heir got killed off. But again, that's another matter. So if you're the younger son, or maybe the fifth son, or God forbid the daughter, you're going to find yourself in a pretty bad situation, and you might very well want to move to an area that has more economic opportunity, no feudal tradition. So this is also going to cause a lot of people to actually move to the New World despite its riskiness because they feel that there's more upward mobility there. And then, of course, there's the religious motivation. And again, this is a big leftover from European history last year. So I'm not going to go into much detail about it. But of course, as you know, there is serious chaos in the church, specifically, you could say in England, because of the English Reformation and the confusion that caused. Of course, the Puritans emerge in England as sort of a reactionary group that was upset about the modifications to the Anglican Church. They were called Puritans because they wanted to, quote, purify the Anglican Church. They did not like the fact that the sacraments from the Catholic Church remained. Okay, so in some ways, Puritans, you could say, were more closely aligned to the Protestants that lived in places like the Holy Roman Empire. Also, it's less known fact, but obviously very important for us to realize that there were also Jews in the very, very early periods of even before colonization, really. There were Jewish explorers or settlers in the New World. So the reason why I say before colonization is that the first known Jew to set foot in North America was Joachim Gans, who actually visited the ill-fated Roanoke colony. So just an interesting fact there. Okay, so the most well-known group that, of course, settles in the Americas first, arguably, of course, as a side note, of course, we know that there were Norse explorations in North America hundreds of years earlier, but nonetheless, the Spanish colonization. We're going to talk about Columbus more in class. I'm not going to spend any time talking about Columbus here, but essentially we need to consider, and we'll use both the people's history of the United States as well as a patriot's history of the United States to really just debate about this question. To what extent was Columbus really a hero? Okay, and we'll talk about Bartolomé de las Casas's opinion about Columbus in just a minute. So that's an historical skill we're going to be working with throughout the year in AP US history, and that's historical argumentation. Also, it's important for us to realize the context that led to the Spanish exploration and Spanish colonization. So the same year that Columbus arrived in the West Indies, 1492, there was a very monumental event in Spanish history known as the Reconquista. So Reconquista loosely translates into reconquering, right? So what this meant was that Spain reconquered the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim Moors that lived there. I mean, essentially during the highest periods of the Ottoman Empire, and or some of the higher periods of the Ottoman Empire, rather. So essentially, this is a huge victory for the Spanish because they sort of re-centralized the Iberian Peninsula under the Catholic Church. One really easy way to remember why the Spanish were extending their empire into the New World, you can think of the 3 G's, right? Gold, glory, and God. Okay, so the Spanish wanted, of course, to be able to extend their economic influence over the world, and also there were tales of precious golds and silvers in the New World. So gold was a huge motivation. Glory, I mean, essentially just celebrating the might of the Spanish Empire. That's a really shortened down version of what glory means. And then as far as God is concerned, really, the Spanish wanted to promote what they believed was their true faith, the Catholic Church. And of course, this is during a period of serious crisis for the Catholic Church, which of course is going to result in the Protestant Reformation in the early 1500s. Also, the Spanish have a rival next door, the Portuguese. Okay, the Portuguese actually sort of gave birth to the Age of Exploration, which I'll talk about in a slide in just a minute. So the Spanish want to also be a contender in the Age of Exploration. So what actually happens is that in 1494, the Pope agrees to this division of the world for Spanish and Portuguese colonization. Okay, so let's think about this imaginary line that is drawn right here. This is the Treaty de Tordesillas line. Okay, everything that fell west of this line belonged to the Spanish, or was open to Spanish colonization and exploration. Everything that fell east of the line went to the Portuguese. Now, the Portuguese, of course, were interested in finding a route to the Indies, so they didn't really care about what was over here. Furthermore, they had no idea what was over here. So you could say in retrospect, the Spanish sort of, quote, won, end quote, the deal, because, of course, they're able to extend their empire, and they also, of course, conquer the indigenous populations that live there. And also these populations die out due to disease. All right, so we'll talk about that in a minute. So just some of the names that you will come across in your reading that you should be familiar with. Okay, so Spanish, well-known explorers. Okay, and then there's some conquistadors in the, not Spanish, this is Portuguese. So anyway, Henry the Navigator, which he actually did not sail, he just commissioned lots of explorations on behalf of the Portuguese. You have Bartholomew Diaz, who reached the southern tip of Africa in the late 1400s, and then Vasco da Gama, who successfully reached India, so basically rounded the Cape of Good Hope and made it all the way up to India. Then on the Spanish side, of course, best known explorer was Christopher Columbus, and we will talk about him in more detail in class. Hernan Cortes, who is best known as a conquistador who conquered the Aztecs in 1521. So the Aztecs were sort of in, as hopefully you know, present-day Mexico, right? And then you have Francisco Pizarro, who conquers the Incas in 1533, and then establishes Lima, which is now the capital of Peru, shortly after that. Okay, so these are the well-known figures, and if you have questions or want to know more specifics, either ask me in class, shoot me an email, do whatever you need, and I can also happily post some further reading links on our website. Okay, so how did the Spanish settle in the New World? Well, one of the systems that you should be familiar with was the encomienda system, which was essentially a form of slavery. So what the Spanish did was they sort of commissioned the indigenous, the native population in these Spanish plantations that they were settling to work for them. Now the exchange, so to speak, was that the indigenous population would be converted to Catholicism. So the Spanish argued that they were essentially saving the indigenous population, but in reality it was their way of justifying enslaving them. Okay, so the encomienda system is very well known, and what you have, and this is very interesting, and we will again talk about this much more in class, is that this is one of the first instances where you have a European actually look at the treatment of the indigenous population and criticize it. Okay, so here's Bartolomé de las Casas and what his role was in this. So Bartolomé de las Casas, another Spanish, actually he was a priest, ends up witnessing the ways in which the Spanish are treating the indigenous population. And in 1552, he publishes this very famous work called The Destruction of the Indies. And here you just see an artist's rendering, or maybe from Bartolomé de las Casas' perspective, of how the natives were treated. Okay, so Bartolomé de las Casas is just sort of a very unique figure in history, because he had the audacity to criticize what the Spanish were doing in a period where almost everyone was looking at this as evidence of the glory of the Spanish Empire. All right, and then lastly, we need to be familiar with this very important consequence or effect of the European contact, or the Spanish initial contact with the New World. Okay, so the Columbian Exchange. This is a very hot topic in AP exams. We'll see how hot it remains with the redesign, but my bet is that this is still going to be very heavily emphasized. So I would encourage you to actually pause the video here and really examine all the different things that are exchanged. Arguably the most significant impact of the contact between Europeans and indigenous people was the fauna that's exchanged, and of course after that the diseases. Actually, I changed my mind. It's the disease that's the most important, because it wipes out millions. Virtually 90% of the indigenous population dies off due to the diseases, mostly smallpox, that are spread to the New World. All right, and then livestock is a secondary importance, but of course the introduction of the horse to the New World is huge. And then introduction of other staple crops such as wheat, rice, barley, and oats. All right, maize or corn was a very significant addition into the European diet. But as you can see, this is just a really important opening up of all of these items that were previously unknown to the opposite New Worlds. I'm going to leave this here. Okay, this is a short overview of chapter 2 from Out of Many, and we're going to talk about this much more in class. All right, any questions, email me, and feel free to subscribe.